Karen fined me $500 for parking my truck in my own driveway, claiming it violated vague aesthetic standards she couldn't even properly define. That moment didn't just irritate me, it triggered something deeper. A calculated response rooted in years of professional experience dealing with compliance systems. I wasn't angry in the usual sense, I was methodical, and I understood exactly how fragile systems become when forced into absolute consistency. Karen believed authority gave her control. She didn't understand what happens when someone applies rules without emotion, only precision and patience. My name is Stefan, and I am a civil engineer specializing in municipal infrastructure, compliance audits, and regulatory enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. I spend my days identifying violations, interpreting ambiguous codes, and ensuring every rule is applied exactly as written without bias or assumption. Rules are not suggestions to me, they are systems. And systems either hold under pressure or collapse when forced into full operational consistency. Riverside Meadows seemed stable when I moved in, structured, organized, and governed by rules that appeared reasonable on paper and manageable in practice. For 3 years, nothing unusual happened. No complaints, no fines, no enforcement issues. Just quiet compliance across a well-maintained suburban neighborhood environment. My truck sat in my driveway every evening, clean, functional, and entirely consistent with what anyone would consider normal residential vehicle ownership standards. Then Karen became HOA president, and within weeks, she decided my truck represented a problem that needed immediate correction under aesthetic interpretation authority. The violation notice arrived formally, structured with legal tone, but lacking substance, relying entirely on subjective language instead of measurable compliance criteria. I read the covenant section carefully and recognized immediately that the language contained no enforceable definition of aesthetic violation regarding vehicle types. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control, disguised as governance, and preference, disguised as regulation. I responded professionally, requesting objective criteria, documented standards, and measurable definitions that could justify the claim against my vehicle specifically. Karen's reply confirmed everything. She had no criteria, only opinion. Reinforced by authority she believed could substitute for legitimate regulatory foundation. I attended the board meeting not to argue emotionally, but to observe how decisions were justified when challenged under structured reasoning and legal framing. The discussion exposed the weakness immediately. Subjective interpretation defended as policy, unsupported by any enforceable language within the governing documents. One board member even acknowledged the flaw, but Karen overruled caution with confidence, reinforcing her position without addressing the legal vulnerability. That was when I made my decision not to fight the rule, but to apply every rule exactly as written across the entire community. I paid the fine immediately, because the payment itself was not the issue. The system behind it was the problem that needed exposure. Then I began reviewing every document governing Riverside Meadows, covenants, bylaws, amendments, guidelines, everything that defined compliance expectations for residents. Over 200 pages of rules existed, and most had not been enforced consistently in years, creating a fragile system full of ignored violations. I started walking the neighborhood systematically, documenting everything with precision measurements, photographs, timestamps, and direct references to specific covenant sections. Paint violations appeared first. Subtle deviations from approved palettes that had gone unnoticed because enforcement had never been consistent or prioritized. Landscaping violations followed, weeds, overgrowth, unmanaged spaces that clearly contradicted written requirements yet remained ignored under selective enforcement practices. Decorative violations were everywhere: flags, ornaments, installations displayed outside approved timelines, all technically non-compliant under the existing rules. Damage, driveway cracks, mailbox inconsistencies, roofing defects, each one documented carefully, each one tied directly to a specific, enforceable clause. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Rules existed, but enforcement was selective, inconsistent, and dependent on personal discretion rather than structure. Then I examined the HOA itself, and what I found was more significant than any individual homeowner violation within the community. Required inspections had not been conducted, financial reports were overdue, Reserve funds were below mandated thresholds, and insurance coverage had lapsed entirely. The governing body enforcing rules was itself in violation of multiple foundational requirements that carried far greater risk than aesthetic concerns about vehicles. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report, structured, detailed, legally precise, supported by evidence and aligned directly with governing documentation requirements. The report was not emotional, not aggressive, just factual, objective, and impossible to dismiss without ignoring the very rules the HOA claimed to enforce. Then I submitted 73 individual violation complaints and 4 formal complaints against the HOA itself for its documented failures. Karen called immediately, her tone shifting from authority to frustration as she realized the scale of what had been initiated. I explained calmly that I was simply exercising my rights under the covenants, requesting enforcement consistency across all documented violations within the community. She called it harassment, I called it compliance. And the distinction mattered because the governing document supported my position entirely. The board convened an emergency meeting, and for the first time, the consequences of selective enforcement became impossible for them to ignore or dismiss. Legal obligations required investigation, and ignoring the complaints would create liability far greater than addressing them directly and systematically. They hired an attorney, then an inspector, and the process began. Methodical, expensive, and entirely predictable given the number of violations documented. 68 of 73 complaints were confirmed as valid violations, requiring formal notices and corrective action across the neighborhood. The community reacted immediately, confusion, frustration, anger spreading as residents received notices for issues that had been ignored for years. And every one of those reactions traced back to the moment Karen chose to enforce a vague rule against a single homeowner. Then the HOA's own violations came under scrutiny. Those consequences were far more expensive than any individual compliance issue in the neighborhood. Insurance had lapsed, requiring costly reinstatement under stricter conditions and increased premiums due to the coverage gap identified during review. Deferred maintenance required immediate repair, and contractors identified tens of thousands of dollars in necessary work that had been neglected. Financial reporting deficiencies required professional accounting services to reconstruct missing documentation and restore compliance with reporting requirements. The costs accumulated rapidly: legal fees, inspections, repairs, accounting services, all triggered by enforcement consistency rather than selective interpretation. And then Karen herself became subject to enforcement, because her own property contained violations documented and confirmed under the same rules. The board had no choice. Enforcement had to remain consistent. And Karen received violation notices just like every other homeowner in the community. She refused to comply, believing her position should exempt her from the same standards she had imposed on others. Fines were issued, daily penalties accumulated, and eventually, a lien was placed against her property when she continued refusing compliance obligations. Her response escalated to legal action, claiming harassment, but the documentation showed uniform enforcement applied across all violations without exception. The case collapsed quickly, and she was ordered to pay legal fees, adding personal financial consequences to an already deteriorating position within the community. Meanwhile, homeowners were dealing with compliance requirements, repair costs, and frustration directed at the leadership decisions that triggered the entire situation. The HOA's reserve funds were depleted, and a special assessment became necessary to cover the financial burden created by enforced compliance actions. That was the breaking point, the moment when the community shifted from passive frustration to active opposition against the leadership responsible for the outcome. At the next meeting, attendance surged, and the tone was no longer cooperative. It was direct, focused, and demanding accountability for the consequences. Karen attempted to justify her actions, but justification failed against documented outcomes and measurable damage to the community's financial stability. A vote of no confidence was called, and the result was decisive: overwhelming removal from her position as HOA president. Leadership changed immediately, and the new board recognized the need to correct not just the situation, but the structure that allowed it to happen. My fine was rescinded, an apology issued. Discussions began on rewriting the covenants to eliminate subjective enforcement language entirely. I agreed to assist, not out of obligation, but because systems work better when designed correctly rather than corrected after failure. We replaced vague language with measurable standards, clear definitions, enforceable criteria that removed personal interpretation from compliance decisions. Vehicles were no longer judged on appearance, only on registration, functionality, and maintenance, objective standards that could be applied consistently. Landscaping, structural maintenance, property conditions were redefined using measurable thresholds instead of subjective descriptions open to interpretation. The revised covenants passed by community vote, and for the first time, enforcement became predictable, fair, and resistant to misuse by individuals. Over time, the neighborhood stabilized. Compliance improved naturally because expectations were clear and enforcement was no longer arbitrary or selective. Residents understood the rules, and more importantly, they trusted the system because it applied equally to everyone without exception. My truck remained in my driveway, unchanged, unremarkable, exactly as it had been before this entire situation began. Karen eventually sold her home, leaving behind a situation that had escalated far beyond what she originally intended when issuing that first violation notice. The irony remained clear. None of this would have happened if she had simply chosen not to enforce a vague rule selectively. But once enforcement began, it required consistency. And consistency revealed every flaw, every oversight, every ignored responsibility within the system. That is the nature of compliance systems. They function until tested fully, and then they reveal whether they were built to withstand pressure. Malicious compliance is not destruction, it is exposure. Forcing systems to operate exactly as written until their weaknesses become impossible to ignore. I did not break any rules. I followed them completely, and that completeness is what created the consequences that followed. The HOA did not fail because of one complaint. It failed because it could not sustain its own rules under full enforcement conditions. That distinction matters because it defines responsibility not as retaliation, but as structural failure exposed through consistent application. Systems designed with ambiguity invite misuse, and misuse leads to instability when challenged by someone who understands how to apply them correctly. Riverside Meadows is stable now, not because rules disappeared, but because they were clarified, strengthened, and aligned with enforceable reality. The difference is not visible immediately, but it exists in every decision. It's every enforcement action, every interaction between residents and the board. Consistency replaced discretion, clarity replaced assumption, and the system became something people could rely on rather than fear unpredictably. That transformation did not happen by accident. It happened because one rule was enforced incorrectly and then enforced correctly in response. The cost was high, financially and structurally, but the result was a system that now functions as intended without dependency on individual authority. My truck remains where it belongs, not as a statement, but as a reminder of what happens when systems are forced to operate completely. Authority without structure fails under pressure, but structure applied consistently reshapes authority into something accountable and sustainable over time. Karen believed control came from position, but control actually comes from systems that cannot be manipulated without consequence. That is the difference between leadership and assumption, and it is a difference that defines outcomes in every governed environment. The lesson is simple, but rarely understood. Rules must either be applied consistently or not applied at all. Anything in between creates instability. And when someone decides to test that inconsistency fully, the results are never small. They scale with the size of the system itself. Riverside Meadows learned that lesson the hard way, but it learned it permanently, and that permanence is what prevents repetition. I never intended to escalate the situation. I simply refused to accept selective enforcement presented as legitimate governance. The outcome was inevitable once the system was forced into full compliance, because incomplete systems cannot survive complete application. And that is why my truck still sits in my driveway tonight, not as defiance, but as proof that consistency is the only real form of justice.